On a snowy Christmas Eve, a 6-year-old girl named Ella is abandoned on the courthouse steps with nothing but a note pinned to her coat. Please take care of her. I can't anymore. Taken in by a single mother and her son, Ella begins to find hope. But her future is threatened when a wealthy couple and her estranged grandmother both fight for custody. As the court battles rage, secrets are revealed and bonds are tested. Will Ella find the loving family she longs for, or will the system decide her fate? The courthouse steps were a graveyard of footprints, their shapes smudged by the relentless snowfall. In the dim glow of the street lamp, a small figure sat huddled against the icy stone wall, clutching a battered teddy bear and a weathered suitcase almost as large as herself. 6-year-old Ella's breath rose in fragile wisps, her cheeks red against her medium brown skin, and her dark eyes were fixed on the swirling snow, unblinking. Pinned to her coat was a piece of paper, its edges crumpled by trembling hands. The message scrawled on it was stark and cold. Please take care of her. I can't anymore. Grace Ramirez saw the note before she saw the girl's face. Rushing up the courthouse steps, her boots crunching against the frozen snow, she paused. Her pulse quickened at the sight of Ella, motionless except for the slight shiver running through her tiny frame. Grace knelt, tugging her scarf tighter around her neck as a gust of icy wind clawed at her. "Hi there, sweetheart," Grace said softly, her voice steady despite the tight knot forming in her chest. "What's your name?" The girl looked at her, unblinking. "Ella," she murmured, barely audible over the storm. Grace exhaled a shaky breath. She didn't need to ask more to piece together enough of the story. The note spoke volume. She reached out, placing a gloved hand on Ella's shoulder. "It's freezing out here, Ella. Why don't we get you somewhere warm?" The little girl hesitated, clutching her suitcase tighter. Grace's heart broke at the sight of those small hands gripping the handle as if it held every ounce of her security. She tried again, her voice gentle but firm. "I promise I'll keep you safe." Ella nodded slowly, her lips quivering as she allowed Grace to guide her to her feet. Together, they trudged back toward the car. The biting wind seemed to protest their departure, stinging Grace's face as she opened the door and helped Ella inside. When Grace slid into the driver's seat, she took a moment to breathe. The weight of responsibility pressed down like the snowstorm outside. At home, the lights of their modest townhouse shone through the frost-covered windows. Grace's 9-year-old son, Ethan, opened the door before she even knocked. His eyes widened when he saw the stranger. "Who's she?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with suspicion. He was tall for his age, his lean frame dwarfed by the oversized sweatshirt he wore. "Her name's Ella," Grace replied, ushering the little girl inside. "She'll be staying with us for a while." "Why?" Ethan folded his arms, but his gaze softened when he noticed Ella's trembling. She looked like a shadow in her oversized coat, her feet still wet from the snow. "Because she needs a place to stay." Grace placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Go grab a blanket from the couch." Ethan hesitated but obeyed, returning moments later with a thick wool blanket. Grace wrapped it around Ella's small shoulders and led her to the sofa. As she watched the girl tuck her knees to her chest, her silence was more telling than words. The night passed slowly. Grace sat by the phone, waiting for child services to call back, while Ella slept fitfully on the couch. Ethan lingered by the doorway, glancing between his mother and the sleeping girl. "She's not staying forever, is she?" he finally asked. Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Ethan. For now, she's safe here, and that's all that matters." As the storm raged outside, Grace felt an unfamiliar unease settle over her. Taking in abandoned children wasn't new to her job, but there was something about Ella, something unspoken, that left her feeling unsteady. She glanced at the note again, the words haunting her. "I can't anymore." Her instincts told her this was more than a simple abandonment, and if the note's cryptic message wasn't enough, Ella's quiet resilience unnerved her. Most kids clung to her when they were scared. Ella sat in silence, as though bracing herself for the next storm. Grace didn't sleep that night. Instead, she watched the snow blanket the streets, a foreboding stillness settling over the world outside. She didn't know it yet, but this storm was only the beginning. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered neighborhood in soft, golden hues. Grace stood in the kitchen, the smell of coffee filling the small space as she stared out the frosted window. She had barely slept. Her thoughts circled Ella like crows over carrion. What had driven her mother to leave her at the courthouse? Why had no one come forward yet? In the living room, Ella sat cross-legged on the floor, a box of crayons and a few sheets of paper spread out in front of her. Ethan, leaning against the wall, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "You can draw here," Ethan said after a long silence. His voice carried an edge, but there was no malice behind it. Ella didn't look up. "Thanks." It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was a start. By mid-morning, Grace's work phone buzzed. The number on the screen made her stomach sink. It was the courthouse. She answered with a clipped, "Grace Ramirez speaking." "Miss Ramirez, we've received custody petitions for Ella Alvarez," the clerk began. "One from her grandmother, Margaret Alvarez, and another from Edward and Claire Harrington." Grace's grip on the phone tightened. "The Harringtons?" "Yes. They're claiming a connection through Ella's mother. They argue they have the financial means to care for her." Grace's jaw clenched. She knew the Harringtons by reputation. A powerful, wealthy couple with a history of charitable gestures that seemed more about appearances than genuine compassion. "Understood. Let me know when the hearing is scheduled," she replied, her tone calm, though her pulse quickened. When Grace hung up, she glanced at Ella, still lost in her drawing. The child's fragility seemed at odds with the storm brewing around her. She deserves better than to be caught in the middle of this, Grace thought. But as a social worker, she knew better than to let emotions cloud her judgment. The court would decide, and all she could do was provide temporary care. Over the next week, the tension in the house softened, replaced by fleeting moments of warmth. Ethan, though reluctant at first, began including Ella in his routines. They baked cookies one evening, their laughter filling the small kitchen as flour dusted their clothes. Another night, he dragged her outside to build a snowman, their red noses and bright smiles glowing under the streetlights. Grace observed them from the window, a pang of longing stirring in her chest. It had been years since she had seen Ethan laugh like that, his guard down. Ella, too, seemed lighter, though the shadows of her past lingered in the way she sometimes stared out the window, her fingers gripping the hem of her shirt. One evening, Grace found Ella hunched over a sketch. The paper was smudged, but the drawing was unmistakable. A family, a woman, a boy, and a girl holding hands. "That's beautiful," Grace said, sitting beside her. Ella shrugged. "It's just a picture." "Is that your family?" Grace asked gently. Ella hesitated, her crayon hovering mid-air. "Not yet," she whispered. Her words were soft but heavy, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Grace's chest tightened. Before she could respond, Ella asked, "Do you think my mom's okay?" The question caught Grace off guard. She chose her words carefully. "I think she wanted what she thought was best for you." Ella frowned. "Then why didn't she stay?" The silence that followed was thick and unbearable. Grace didn't have an answer. The first court hearing was set for the following Monday. Grace sat in the back of the room with Ella, her small hand clutching Grace's tightly. Margaret Alvarez, a frail woman with deep lines etched into her face, shuffled to the stand. Her voice quavered as she professed her love for Ella, admitting that while her finances were strained, her heart was full of love for her granddaughter. The Harringtons, seated on the opposite side of the courtroom, watched impassively. When it was their turn, Edward Harrington's polished tone filled the room. "We can provide Ella with every opportunity, education, stability, and the life she deserves," his wife, Claire, added. "A child's future should not be dictated by sentimentality. We are in a position to secure her happiness." Grace's stomach churned at the cold detachment in their words. "She's not a project," she wanted to scream. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, listened intently before speaking. "Given the complexity of this case, I will allow Ella to remain in her current temporary placement until further review." Relief washed over Grace, but it was short-lived. She knew this was just the beginning. That night, Ella woke screaming from a nightmare. Grace rushed to her side, gathering the trembling girl in her arms. "What was it?" Grace whispered, stroking her hair. "She left me," Ella sobbed. "She said she'd come back, but she didn't." Grace held her tighter, her heart breaking anew. "You're safe now, I promise." But promises felt fragile against the storm that loomed ahead. Every passing day brought the hearing closer, and with it, the possibility that Ella would be ripped from the small, fragile family they were building. Outside, the snow fell in heavy silence, mirroring the weight in Grace's chest. The days leading up to Christmas brought more than snow. They brought uncertainty, tension, and the feeling that time was slipping away. Grace watched as Ella grew quieter, retreating into herself. Even Ethan, whose growing bond with Ella had been a bright spot, seemed to sense the unease that hung over their small home like a dark cloud. On a particularly frigid evening, Grace received a call from the courthouse. The final hearing had been moved up. The Harringtons had pushed for an expedited decision, citing Ella's urgent need for permanent placement. Grace set the phone down, her hands trembling. She knew what this meant. The Harringtons were making their move, and she wasn't sure if she could stop them. That Saturday, Grace bundled Ethan and Ella into the car and drove to the nearby park, desperate to give them a moment of normalcy. The sun glinted off the untouched snow, and the air carried a biting chill, but the children's laughter warmed Grace's heart as she watched them throw snowballs and topple over in fits of giggles. For a moment, everything felt right. But as they returned to the car, a sleek, black sedan pulled up beside them. Edward Harrington stepped out, his expensive overcoat immaculate, despite the muddy snow beneath his polished shoes. His smile was polite, but hollow. "Ms. Ramirez," he greeted, his gaze sliding to Ella. "I thought we might find you here." Grace's body tensed as she stepped protectively in front of Ella. "What do you want, Mr. Harrington?" "I only want what's best for the child," Edward said smoothly. "Claire and I believe that's with us. And given our resources, I think the court will agree." Ella peeked out from behind Grace, her wide eyes darting nervously between the adults. "Ella's not a pawn in your game," Grace snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "She's a little girl who needs love, not just resources." Edward's expression didn't falter, but his tone hardened. "We'll see what the judge thinks about that." He left without another word, his departure as cold as the winter air. Grace clenched her fists, fighting the urge to shout after him. Instead, she turned to Ella, who was trembling, not from the cold, but from fear. "Don't worry," Grace said, crouching to meet her eyes. "I'm not going to let them take you." Ella didn't respond, but the tears in her eyes spoke volumes. The final hearing arrived far too quickly. Grace barely slept the night before, her mind racing through every possible argument, every potential outcome. When the day came, the courtroom felt suffocating. The Harringtons sat with their lawyer, their polished appearances a stark contrast to Margaret Alvarez, who looked frail and out of place in the imposing space. Ella sat beside Grace, her small hand clutching Grace's so tightly it hurt. Ethan, seated a few rows back, gave Grace a reassuring nod. The Harringtons' lawyer presented their case first, emphasizing their wealth, stability, and ability to provide Ella with every advantage in life. Edward and Claire spoke with rehearsed sincerity, describing the life they envisioned for Ella, a life of private schools, vacations, and endless opportunity. When Margaret took the stand, her voice wavered, but her love for Ella was undeniable. "She's my blood," Margaret said, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the witness stand. "I may not have much, but I have love, and that should count for something." Finally, it was Grace's turn. She stood, her heart pounding as she addressed the judge. "Ella needs more than a roof over her head or a trust fund. She needs stability, love, and a family that sees her as more than an obligation or an asset. Over these weeks, I've seen her laugh, cry, and begin to heal. She deserves to be with people who truly care for her, not just for what they can give, but for who she is." Her voice broke slightly, but she pressed on. "I'm asking for the chance to give her that family, to give her the love she needs." As she sat down, she caught Edward's smirk, as though he was confident the judge would side with him. The weight of the moment was crushing. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered her ruling. "Given the complexity of this case and the needs of the child, I will render my decision in 24 hours. Ella will remain in her current placement until then." Grace felt both relief and dread. They had one more day before everything could fall apart. That night, Ella climbed into Grace's lap, clutching her teddy bear. "What's going to happen to me?" she whispered. Grace hugged her tightly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. "I don't know, sweetheart, but whatever happens, I'll fight for you." As Ella fell asleep in her arms, Grace knew the stakes couldn't be higher. Tomorrow would decide everything, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face the storm ahead. The courthouse was eerily quiet the next morning, the kind of silence that amplified every creak and shuffle of footsteps. Grace sat in the waiting area, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ella leaned against her, clutching her ever-present teddy bear. Ethan sat beside them, his jaw set, his normally playful face etched with tension. "I don't like them," Ethan said suddenly, his voice low but firm. Grace glanced at him. "Who?" "The Harringtons. They talk about Ella like she's something they can buy." His voice wavered, but his resolve didn't. "She's not." Grace reached out, squeezing his shoulder. "I know, buddy, we just have to trust the judge to see that." But trust felt fragile against the weight of what was at stake. The hearing began promptly at 9. The judge, her expression unreadable, called the room to order. Grace noticed Ella's grandmother, Margaret, sitting alone near the back, her hands folded in her lap as she stared straight ahead. The Harringtons were as composed as ever, their lawyer already rising to present final arguments. "As we have demonstrated," the lawyer began, pacing the courtroom with a practiced ease, "the Harringtons can provide a stable, prosperous environment for Ella. Stability is critical for a child's development, and my clients have the means to ensure that Ella's future is secure." The lawyer's words hung in the air, clinical and calculated. Grace stole a glance at Ella, who sat silently, her wide eyes fixed on the judge. Margaret was next. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but her words were heartfelt. "Ella is my granddaughter. She belongs with her family. I may not have much, but I can give her love. Isn't that what matters most?" When it was Grace's turn, she stood, her knees shaking beneath her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "This case isn't about money or even blood ties. It's about what Ella needs right now. She's been through more pain than any child should ever face. What she needs is love, stability, and a chance to heal." She took a deep breath, locking eyes with the judge. "Over the past few weeks, I've seen Ella begin to find her smile again. She's formed bonds, not just with me, but with my son, Ethan. She's starting to feel safe. That's not something you can buy, and it's not something you can force. It's something that grows when a child knows they're cared for." Grace glanced back at Ella, whose small face was a mix of fear and hope. "All I'm asking for is the chance to give her the family she deserves." When she sat down, the courtroom was silent. The judge nodded, her expression inscrutable, and announced a recess before her ruling. The wait felt endless. Grace paced the hallway outside the courtroom, her mind racing with every possible outcome. Ethan sat on the bench with Ella, trying to distract her by pointing out shapes in the courthouse tiles. Finally, the doors opened, and everyone filed back in. The judge's face was calm, but her words carried the weight of a hammer. "After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, I have reached a decision," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. "While the Harringtons undoubtedly have the financial means to provide for Ella, this court finds that stability and emotional connection are paramount to a child's well-being." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "I also acknowledge the love and dedication shown by Ms. Ramirez, who has gone above and beyond to create a nurturing environment for Ella during a difficult time. Therefore, I am granting permanent custody to Grace Ramirez." A stunned silence filled the room, broken only by a muffled sob from Grace. She turned to Ella, who stared at her with wide eyes before throwing her arms around her neck. "We're staying?" Ella whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Grace hugged her tightly. "We're staying." Behind them, Ethan grinned, his relief palpable. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks but managed a small smile. The Harringtons left without a word, their polished facades cracking ever so slightly. That evening, the small house glowed with warmth. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and the faint scent of hot cocoa filled the air. Ethan and Ella sat on the floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and laughter as they opened small, thoughtful gifts. Grace watched from the couch, her heart full for the first time in years. Ella unwrapped a small stocking, her name carefully stitched into the fabric. She looked at Grace, tears shining in her eyes. "This is for me?" she asked. "It's yours," Grace said, her voice soft. "Just like this home, just like us." Ella hugged the stocking tightly before setting it down to pull Grace and Ethan into a group hug. They sat there, tangled in each other's arms, the weight of the past weeks melting away. Later, as the snow fell gently outside, Ella grabbed a piece of paper and her crayons. She drew a picture, a small family of 3 standing together in the snow, the word home scrawled at the top. Grace framed the picture the next morning. It hung on their living room wall, a simple reminder of what they had fought for: love, resilience, and a family built not by blood, but by choice. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment about your favorite moment. Stories like these thrive on your thoughts and reflections. Let's keep sharing the warmth.